Hey, what's going on, everyone? So, this is part three in a video series taking a look at the lawsuit filed by the Osundairo brothers against the attorneys for Jesse Smollett. So, basically, what we're going to do is we're going to look at other parts of this lawsuit, and we're going to basically do an analysis. Before we get into this, I just want to reiterate, I'm not a lawyer. I don't have a law degree. I'm just doing this for fun and entertainment. If you haven't seen the Osundairo brothers, here they are. This is what they look like. So I covered the other sections in other videos. So this section, I'm actually going to do some reading, and hopefully you don't fall asleep. So I'll try to get through this as quickly as possible. So this video is basically uh, directed at the defendant Tina Glendane, and it's about count one, and it's basically common law defamation per se. Okay, so the statements accusing the plaintiffs of committing a hate crime, perjury, and conspiring to make false statements to Chicago police. On around March 27, 2019, defendant Tina Glendane appeared on Good Morning America, aired by the American Broadcasting Corporation, you know it as ABC. On around March 28, 2019, Ms. Glendane appeared on the Today Show and aired by the national broadcasting company NBC. In both appearances, Ms. Glendane discussed her client, Mr. Smollett, and his criminal case. The following statements were echoed in numerous other publications, including the podcast Reasonable Doubt. I've never heard of this podcast, actually. And all the statements alleged below were in concert and coordination with the defendants, Mark Garagos, and the defendant Garagos and Garagos Law Firm. Okay, Mrs. Glendane insisted Mr. Smollett was innocent of making a false police report and falsely added that the plaintiffs, the Osundairo brothers, criminally attacked Mr. Smollett. Ms. Glendane then falsely submitted that the plaintiffs may have been wearing whiteface while attacking Mr. Smollett, again stating the plaintiffs battered Mr. Smollett and added the implication that the battery was a hate crime. Mrs. Glendane's statements that the plaintiffs committed a hate crime against Mr. Smollett and Don Whiteface were published to two third parties everywhere as they were broadcast by ABC, NBC, and were published in numerous newspapers, blogs, and periodicals. Mrs. Glendane's statements explicitly identified the plaintiffs as the subject of her accusations, as she was responding directly to the questions of the about the Osundairo brothers. Mrs. Glendane's statements indicated the plaintiffs actually criminally battered Mr. Smollett without his consent are patently false and defamatory, as Mr. Smollett originated, planned, and orchestrated the attack. Mrs. Glendane, in stating that the plaintiffs criminally battered Mr. Smollett, implicitly proffered the plaintiffs are guilty of perjuring themselves during the February 20th, 2019 grand jury proceeding, and she specifically stated in the media appearances. Mrs. Glendane, in stating that the plaintiffs criminally battered Mr. Smollett, implicitly proffered the plaintiffs are guilty of conspiring to give false statements and or give false statements to police, Chicago police, and specifically stated such in media appearances. Mrs. Glendane's statements that the plaintiff Don Whiteface on the day of Mr. Smollett's alleged attack are patently false and defamatory, as neither wore whiteface or pretend in any way to be a Caucasian. Mrs. Glendane's statements were made after the close of Mr. Smollett's criminal case, did not serve any legal function, and was not a requirement of her job as a defense attorney. Instead, these statements were unnecessarily made on national media to advance Mr. Smollett and Mrs. Glendane's reputation and fame at a high cost to the plaintiffs. Indeed, Mrs. Glendane's statements have caused considerable damage to the plaintiffs' careers, as have lost talent agent contracts and career opportunities. Thus, Mrs. Glendane's statements have caused plaintiffs irreparable financial damage. As a result, Mrs. Glendane's comments, plaintiffs have suffered significant emotional distress and feel unsafe and alienated in their local Chicago community. This is because Mrs. Glendane, a very famous attorney, falsely and publicly stated plaintiffs have committed a gruesome hate crime, lied under oath, and intentionally misled the Chicago Police Department. Actually, I'm gonna stop right here. It's actually interesting. I actually read the entire case, but it's interesting because they don't have a count for intentional infliction of emotional distress and or negligent infliction of emotional distress, which in my opinion, they should have kind of like thrown that in there. Maybe after watching this video, they'll go back and throw it in. I don't know. But anyway, Mrs. Glendane's statements have caused plaintiffs severe emotional damage. Mrs. Glendane, in falsely accusing plaintiffs of committing a hate crime, perjuring themselves, and making false statements to a police officer, has acted with fault clearly amounting to negligence and or actual malice. Now, again, I think there should be a separate count for emotional distress, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and negligent infliction of emotional distress. Negligent infliction of emotional distress, as well as what's the other one? As well as actual malice, I guess. I don't know. It's interesting that they didn't put those in. So, just continuing on, Mrs. Glandane's comments in falsely accusing the plaintiffs of committing a hate crime, perjuring themselves, and making false statements of police officers are defamatory per se under Illinois common law. As a result, Mrs. Glandane's false and defamatory statements plaintiffs suffered and will continue to suffer damages, including economic damages, damage to their reputations, and or damages to current and prospective business relationships. And then part two of this section, basically statements harming plaintiffs in their profession and implying a lack of integrity in the plaintiff's professional duties. Okay, on around April 6, 2019, defendant Tina Glandane further discussed the plaintiffs on the Reasonable Doubt podcast. Mrs. Glandane's statements were made after the close of Smollett's criminal case did not serve any legal. This is kind of like a repeat what was already said. Ms. Glandane knew the plaintiffs were partially self-employed as creators and promoters of their brand Team Able. Team Able advises and demonstrates how to strengthen and build muscle while maintaining a healthy steroid-free diet and fitness regimen. Mrs. Glandane falsely stated the plaintiffs are involved in illegal Nigerian steroids trafficking and that these steroids help clients lose weight. Nigerian steroid trafficking, is that really a thing? Sorry, I'm just going to take a minute to do a YouTube search. I, I've never heard of this. I mean, I've heard of steroids, but Nigerian steroids? Yeah, I don't even know if that's a thing. I'm not going to waste time on it, but I noticed that in this lawsuit, they mentioned Nigerian steroids, and I don't do they manufacture steroids in Nigeria? Is it like a special steroid that's manufactured there? I mean, I don't know. So, at any rate, Mrs. Glendane added, scoffing that the plaintiff's platform is all about being steroid free. Their whole thing is, all natural bodybuilding. It's ridiculous. Plaintiffs do not use or distribute illegal Nigerian steroids. Again, I don't really think Nigerian steroids is a thing. Mrs. Glendane's comments are patently false and defamatory. These statements were unnecessarily made publicly to numerous third parties to advance Mrs. Glendane's reputation and fame, to undoubtedly ruin the plaintiff's business. So it's basically going to go on, essentially saying the same thing. Let me just skip forward and we'll go to part three of this section. Statements falsely accusing plaintiffs of engaging in fornication with Mrs. Smollett. On around April 6, 2019, defendant Tina Glandane further discussed the plaintiff's Abel Osundairo, hereafter Bola Osundairo. Basically, on the podcast Reasonable Doubt, Mrs. Glandane inferred that Bola Osundairo and Mrs. Smollett engaged at least briefly in homosexual acts together. These statements were made to third-party press and the public. So basically, this section will basically go on to talk about how this statement put the gentleman's life at risk because he goes home to Nigeria, and basically they're saying in Nigeria they recognize homosexuality as kind of like homosexuality is not tolerated. I'm sorry, in Nigeria, and basically, it's alleging that they kill homosexuals, or it's alluding to, I believe, that they kill homosexuals in Nigeria. I don't know if that's true. But and it's also basically saying that his reputation is damaged because he's essentially saying he's not a homosexual, and he was even dating a female at the time, and so claims that he had a sexual relationship with Smollett, basically damaged his reputation. So I'm basically going to stop this video right here, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about count two, common law false light, and then we'll get into the details of that. So please, if you have any questions, comments, please leave them below and subscribe. Bye.